I guess after 6 beers, the truth finally slipped out. You were never supposed to be here, Robert Carter said with a crooked grin, lifting his bottle as if he had just delivered the punchline of the night. The backyard was strung with red, white, and blue lights for the 4th of July, burgers still sizzling on the grill, the smell of charcoal and sweet barbecue sauce drifting across the warm Texas air. Laughter rippled through the crowd at first, the kind of uneasy laughter people use when they are not sure whether something is a joke or a confession. Emily Carter stood near the patio table, a paper plate in her hand, potato salad untouched, her fingers tightening just slightly around the flimsy edge as the words settled over her like humidity before a storm. She was 32 years old, a marketing analyst from Austin who had driven 3 hours to spend the holiday with her father and extended family. And in that single careless sentence, something in her posture changed. Robert took another swig, waving his bottle loosely. Relax, he added, chuckling. Every family's got one surprise, right? A few cousins avoided eye contact. Her Aunt Linda cleared her throat and reached for more lemonade, as if refilling her cup might erase what had just been said. Firecrackers popped in the distance, sharp and celebratory, but Emily heard only the echo of one word repeating in her mind: accident. She managed a small, polite smile, the kind she had perfected at office meetings and uncomfortable dinners, and set her plate down carefully on the table as though even that small movement required concentration. The American flag hanging over the fence fluttered in a light breeze, and somewhere behind her, children shrieked happily as they chased each other with sparklers, unaware that a quiet fracture had just opened in the center of the gathering. Robert was already moving on, telling a story about his fishing trip last spring, slapping his brother on the shoulder, acting as though nothing unusual had happened. But Emily could feel the weight of sideways glances, the way conversations shifted when she stepped closer, the way her cousin Megan squeezed her arm a little too tightly and whispered, "He's had a long day." It wasn't the first time her father had embarrassed her after drinking, but it was the first time the joke had felt deliberate, rehearsed even. She thought back to childhood birthdays when he'd arrived late from work, to soccer games where he'd stayed in the truck to take calls, to the way her mother, Margaret, had always stepped in with a soft explanation, smoothing things over, saying, "Your dad just shows love differently." Margaret had passed away 2 years earlier after a quiet battle with illness, and since then the house felt less like a home and more like a museum of unresolved conversations. As the sun dipped lower and the sky turned a hazy orange, Emily realized that what hurt most was not the laughter or even the word itself, but the casual certainty in her father's voice. It had not sounded like a drunken mistake. It had sounded like something he had believed for decades and finally felt bold enough to say out loud. And as the first fireworks burst overhead, bright and explosive against the darkening sky, Emily understood that this holiday would not be remembered for the food or the music or the celebration, but for the moment she began to question the story she had been told about her own beginning. Emily drove back to Austin the next morning with the radio turned off, the highway stretching out in a long, flat line beneath the pale summer sun, and for 3 straight hours she replayed every detail of the previous night, as if reviewing footage from a security camera. The words themselves were sharp, but it was the tone that unsettled her most, the easy confidence, the way her father had not looked surprised by what he had said. When she pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, the digital clock on her dashboard read 10:32 in the morning, and she realized she had not eaten since the day before. Inside her quiet one-bedroom apartment, the air conditioning hummed steadily, offering relief from the July heat, but nothing quieted the steady rhythm of questions forming in her mind. She set her keys down on the kitchen counter and leaned against the refrigerator, staring at the framed photo of her mother that hung near the hallway, taken 5 years earlier at a family reunion by Lake Travis. Margaret had been wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat, her smile soft and patient, her arm wrapped around Emily's shoulders in a way that always felt protective without being possessive. Growing up, whenever there was tension in the house, Margaret had been the buffer, the translator of Robert's moods, the one who said things like, "He worries more than he shows," or "He never planned on fatherhood happening so fast, but that does not mean he does not care." At the time, Emily had accepted those explanations because children want simple answers and steady ground beneath their feet. Now, standing alone in her kitchen at 32, she began to wonder how many of those explanations had been shields rather than truths. She walked to her bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, where she kept the few things she had brought back from her parents' house after her mother passed away. There were old recipe cards written in neat blue ink, a hand-sewn quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, and a small stack of greeting cards tied together with ribbon. Emily sat cross-legged on the carpet and untied the ribbon slowly, reading birthday messages and holiday notes that all ended the same way, with love expressed in careful, deliberate handwriting. What struck her now was the consistency in her mother's words about choice. In one card from her 21st birthday, Margaret had written, "You are the best decision I ever made." At the time it had sounded sentimental. Now it felt deliberate. Emily's chest tightened as a new possibility formed, one she had never allowed herself to consider. What if the story she had been told about her beginning had been incomplete? What if her mother had carried a version of events that she had never fully shared? The more Emily thought about it, the more she remembered subtle moments, late-night conversations that stopped when she entered the room, the way her mother sometimes looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work or illness. Emily rose from the floor and walked to her desk, opening her laptop but not turning it on. Instead, she sat there, hands folded, staring at nothing in particular. She was not angry yet. Anger required certainty. What she felt instead was a slow, steady shift in perspective, as though a photograph she had stared at for years was suddenly revealing details hidden in the background. The holiday gathering had been loud and public, but the truth, whatever it was, felt quiet and private, waiting somewhere in the spaces her mother had left behind. And for the first time since the fireworks faded, Emily understood that if there was an answer to be found, it would not come from another confrontation in a crowded backyard. It would come from the past, from something written or saved, from a voice that had always chosen her carefully. The next evening, Emily found herself standing in front of the small storage unit on the edge of Austin that she had rented after selling most of her mother's belongings. The metal door warmed to the touch from the lingering heat of the day, and for a moment she questioned whether she was overreacting to a careless sentence spoken over grilled burgers and fireworks. Yet the unease had not faded. It had grown quieter and more focused, settling into her like a steady pulse. She unlocked the padlock and lifted the door, the scent of dust and cardboard rising into the still air. Inside were neatly labeled boxes she had not had the courage to sort through completely, items too personal to discard and too heavy with memory to keep in her apartment. She stepped inside and pulled the cord to switch on the single overhead bulb, its yellow light casting long shadows against the concrete floor. There were photo albums, old tax records, a sewing machine her mother rarely used in later years, and a narrow filing cabinet that had once stood in the corner of her parents' bedroom. Emily knelt in front of the cabinet and slid open the top drawer, flipping carefully through hanging folders labeled in her mother's precise handwriting. Medical records, insurance policies, warranties for appliances long replaced. Everything was organized, almost methodical, as if Margaret had anticipated a day when someone would need to understand the structure of her life. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of manila envelopes, Emily found a slim leather portfolio she did not recognize. It was worn at the edges but clean, secured with a simple strap. She hesitated before opening it, aware that whatever she found might confirm her doubts or force her to abandon them entirely. Inside were several documents folded in thirds, along with a sealed envelope bearing her name in familiar blue ink. The sight of it made her inhale sharply. Her name was written fully. Emily Grace Carter, the way her mother had addressed her in formal letters and graduation cards. The envelope was dated 3 years earlier, several months before Margaret's health began to decline. Emily sat back on her heels, the concrete cool beneath her, and traced the outline of the ink with her fingertip. Around her, the storage unit felt unusually quiet despite the faint sound of traffic from the nearby highway. She realized that her mother had not been a woman who left loose ends. If there was something to explain, something to clarify, it would be written clearly and without drama. Emily did not open the envelope immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes and remembered the countless times her mother had defended her father, smoothing over arguments with calm phrases, insisting that love was not always loud or expressive. Now, faced with the physical evidence of a letter never mentioned, Emily felt a shift from uncertainty to intent. The careless comment at the holiday gathering had cracked open a door, but this envelope might reveal whether the crack led to a misunderstanding or to a truth carefully hidden for decades. With steady hands and a quiet breath, she broke the seal, aware that whatever waited inside would not change who she was. But it might finally explain why she had always felt slightly out of place in the story her father told about their family. Emily unfolded the letter carefully, the paper thinner than she expected, as if it had been chosen for writing rather than durability, and the first line alone made her sit up straighter on the concrete floor. Margaret's handwriting was steady, not rushed, not emotional, just deliberate, as though she had measured every word before committing it to ink. She began by acknowledging that there were truths within their family that had been simplified for the sake of peace, and that peace, while comforting, often came at the cost of clarity. Emily read slowly, her eyes moving across the page while the single overhead bulb hummed faintly above her. Margaret explained that when she discovered she was expecting a child, the timing had been complicated. Robert had recently accepted a promotion that required long hours and constant travel across Texas and neighboring states, and he had expressed fear about becoming a father before he felt financially and professionally secure. Margaret did not describe arguments in detail, nor did she dramatize the tension, but she made it clear that the idea of parenthood had not been embraced equally at first. Emily felt her heartbeat rise as she continued reading. Margaret wrote that there had been conversations about postponing motherhood, about waiting for a better moment, about prioritizing career advancement and stability. Yet she also wrote that from the instant she realized she was carrying a child, she felt a certainty that surprised even her. She described sitting alone at the kitchen table late at night, calculating expenses on a yellow legal pad, measuring fear against conviction. She admitted that Robert had used the word mistake once, in frustration, during a difficult week, but she emphasized that fear does not always equal rejection. Emily paused at that sentence, letting it settle. The letter continued, explaining that over time, Robert adjusted outwardly, preparing a nursery, attending appointments, telling friends he was excited. But Margaret admitted that there were moments when she sensed hesitation beneath his enthusiasm, a subtle distance she chose not to confront directly. She wrote that she believed love could grow into the spaces fear once occupied, and for many years she convinced herself that it had. Emily swallowed as she reached the next paragraph. Margaret wrote, very plainly, that her daughter was never an accident. She was a choice, one Margaret made consciously, fully aware of the uncertainty ahead. The word choice was underlined once, not heavily, but firmly enough to signal intention. Margaret explained that she had not told Emily the full story because she did not want her daughter to carry the weight of adult fears that had nothing to do with her worth. She had hoped that by the time the past surfaced, Emily would be strong enough to understand that hesitation in others does not define a person's value. As Emily reached the end of the first page, she felt a quiet shift inside her. The holiday remark now seemed less like a sudden revelation and more like an echo from a conversation decades old. Margaret had not written with anger. She had written with clarity. And sitting alone in the storage unit, the paper resting in her hands, Emily understood that the truth she was uncovering was not explosive or dramatic. It was layered, measured, and deeply human. Yet it also confirmed something she could no longer ignore. The distance she had felt from her father had roots that stretched back to before she was even born. Emily turned the page slowly, aware that whatever followed would either soften the edges of what she had learned or sharpen them beyond comfort. Margaret's writing remained calm, almost instructional, as if she were guiding her daughter through a memory rather than confessing a secret. She explained that after Emily was born, Robert did what was expected of him. He worked longer hours, saved diligently, and told neighbors that fatherhood had changed him for the better. On the surface, they looked like a stable American family in a modest brick house outside Dallas, complete with weekend grocery runs and summer road trips measured in miles and gas station stops. Yet Margaret admitted that there were subtle differences between responsibility and joy. She wrote that Robert fulfilled his duties, but rarely lingered in moments. He attended school plays, but often checked his watch. He helped assemble birthday bicycles on Christmas Eve, but left the room once the excitement began. None of it was cruel. None of it was dramatic. It was simply distant. Margaret described how she compensated quietly, filling the house with warmth, making sure Emily never questioned whether she was wanted. She recounted evenings when Emily would fall asleep on the couch during movie nights and Margaret would carry her to bed, noticing that Robert rarely offered to help. She did not accuse him of neglect. Instead, she acknowledged that some people struggle with bonds they did not plan for, especially when those bonds alter the path they once imagined for themselves. Emily felt a strange mix of relief and ache as she read those words. The letter did not paint her father as a villain, but it also did not protect him from accountability. Margaret wrote that over the years she hoped Robert's affection would deepen, and in certain seasons it did. There were family camping trips where he laughed freely, afternoons when he coached Emily through algebra homework with unexpected patience. But Margaret admitted that the underlying hesitation never disappeared entirely. It showed up in small remarks, in jokes that carried an edge, in moments when Robert referred to life before parenthood as simpler, freer. Emily paused again, recalling comments from her teenage years when her father would say, "We did not see this coming," in a tone that felt more factual than affectionate. At the time she had brushed it aside. Now those memories felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle aligning quietly. Margaret's final paragraphs on the page were direct. She wrote that if Emily ever heard her existence reduced to chance or inconvenience, she must remember that she was neither. She was chosen in a kitchen lit by a single overhead bulb, after hours of reflection and courage. Margaret had accepted uncertainty and moved forward anyway. As Emily finished reading the second page, she felt the weight of her mother's intention more strongly than ever. The backyard comment from days earlier no longer felt random. It felt like a glimpse into a truth her father had never fully reconciled within himself. And for the first time, Emily realized that the story of her life had never been about whether she was planned. It had always been about who was brave enough to claim her without hesitation. Emily remained seated on the concrete floor long after she finished the second page, the letter resting lightly in her hands as if it weighed more emotionally than physically. The single bulb above her flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft circle of light that made the storage unit feel smaller and more intimate. She read the final page slowly, aware that each sentence carried the careful balance her mother had always maintained between honesty and restraint. Margaret wrote that she had never regretted her decision. Not once, not during sleepless nights with a colicky infant, not during tight financial months when grocery lists were measured against paychecks, and not during the quiet evenings when Robert seemed distant even while sitting at the same dinner table. She admitted that marriage, like parenthood, sometimes reveals parts of people that are not polished or proud. She explained that Robert had grown up in a household where emotions were rarely expressed openly, where success was measured in promotions and square footage rather than in conversations or affection. Margaret suggested that his hesitation had less to do with Emily and more to do with his own fear of failing at something he could not control. Emily let that thought settle, recognizing how easily insecurity can disguise itself as indifference. Yet Margaret did not excuse the comment that might one day surface. She wrote that if Robert ever reduced Emily's existence to chance, it would be a reflection of his unresolved doubt, not a statement of fact. The letter ended with a simple instruction: remember who chose you and why. The ink trailed slightly at the end of the final word, as if her mother had paused before placing the pen down. Emily folded the pages carefully and held them against her chest for a brief moment, not dramatically, but instinctively, as if grounding herself in the steady clarity her mother had offered. Around her, the hum of distant traffic filtered through the thin walls of the storage facility, reminding her that life outside continued at its usual pace. She rose slowly, placing the letter back into its envelope but not sealing it, and slid it into her purse. For years, she had accepted a version of her family shaped by convenience and quiet compromises. Now she understood that the narrative had been more complex, layered with fear, adaptation, and silent resilience. She did not feel anger rushing through her. Instead, she felt something steadier and more mature: context. The remark from the holiday gathering had felt like a sudden rupture, but this letter revealed it as the echo of a conversation that had never fully resolved within her father. Emily turned off the overhead bulb and stepped outside, lowering the metal door behind her. The Texas evening air was still warm, hovering near 90 degrees even as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. She stood beside her car for a moment, looking at the pale sky, aware that the next step would not involve shouting or dramatic confrontation. It would require composure. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was documented in careful handwriting. And for the first time since the fireworks lit the sky, Emily felt less like someone reacting to a careless comment and more like someone preparing to address a history that had quietly shaped her entire life. Emily did not call her father that night. Instead, she drove home from the storage unit with the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside her, as if it were another person in the car, silent but present. The sun had fully set, and the Austin skyline glowed faintly in the distance, office buildings lit in squares of white and gold. She kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, her thoughts no longer racing but aligning into something structured. The letter had given her clarity, but clarity did not automatically dictate action. When she reached her apartment, she placed the envelope on her kitchen table and poured herself a glass of water, the ice clinking sharply against the glass in the otherwise quiet room. She sat down and read the final paragraph once more, focusing on the underlined word that had shifted everything. Chosen. It echoed differently now, less like reassurance and more like a foundation. She opened her phone and scrolled through recent messages from her father. There were brief texts about the weather, about a neighbor's new truck, about an upcoming family birthday. Nothing hinted at self-reflection. Nothing suggested regret. She considered whether confronting him immediately would lead anywhere productive. Robert was a man who preferred short conversations and controlled narratives. If she approached him emotionally, he would likely deflect with humor or retreat behind practicality. Emily understood that if she wanted answers, she would need to approach the conversation differently. She walked to her desk and opened a notebook, writing down the date of the holiday gathering, followed by a simple sentence. What did you mean when you said that? She did not embellish it. She did not add accusation. She wrote it as a question, clean and direct. Then she wrote another line beneath it. Did you ever see me as temporary? The act of putting the questions on paper steadied her. She was not seeking drama. She was seeking honesty. Across the room, her mother's photograph seemed to watch quietly, not with expectation, but with the calm confidence of someone who had already faced difficult truths. Emily imagined how her mother would have handled this moment. Not with raised voices, not with public confrontation, with composure, with patience, with documentation. She slid the letter back into her purse, deciding that when the time came, she would read from it if necessary, not as a weapon, but as context. The next morning, she checked her calendar and noticed that she would be in Dallas the following weekend for a work conference. Her father's house was less than 20 miles from the hotel. The proximity felt less like coincidence and more like timing. Emily closed her notebook and set it beside her purse. She did not feel like a daughter seeking approval. She felt like an adult preparing to have a conversation that had been delayed for more than 3 decades. Outside her window, traffic moved steadily along the street below, headlights tracing quiet lines through the night. Life continued at its usual pace, indifferent to personal revelations. But inside her apartment, something had shifted permanently. The comment at the holiday gathering had opened a door. The letter had revealed what stood behind it. Now, Emily understood that the next step would not be about proving her worth. It would be about asking her father whether he had ever fully understood it. The following week passed with a quiet kind of focus that surprised Emily. She attended meetings, answered emails, and prepared presentations for the upcoming conference in Dallas. Yet beneath the surface of her professional routine, there was a steady awareness of what awaited her. On Friday morning, she packed a small suitcase, placing the envelope carefully between 2 folded sweaters, as if it were as essential as her laptop charger or business attire. The drive north along Interstate 35 felt different this time, the familiar stretch of highway marked by rest stops and billboards now carrying a subtle sense of purpose. As she crossed into the Dallas city limits, traffic thickened, brake lights glowing red in the late afternoon sun. She checked into her hotel, a modern building with glass doors and polished floors, and stood for a moment in her room overlooking the busy street below. Her father's house was less than 30 minutes away. She sent him a simple message. I am in town for work this weekend. Would you be available for dinner tomorrow? His reply came 10 minutes later. Sure. Come by around 6. I will grill something. The normalcy of his response almost felt surreal. There was no mention of the holiday gathering, no acknowledgement of anything unusual. Saturday evening arrived warm and clear, the temperature hovering in the low 80s even as the sun began to set. Emily parked in the driveway of the house she had grown up in, noticing the same neatly trimmed lawn and the same blue pickup truck in the garage. The porch light flicked on as she stepped out of her car. Robert opened the front door before she knocked, wearing a faded polo shirt and jeans, his expression casual. "You made good time," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The living room looked nearly identical to how she remembered it, though the photographs on the mantel now included more images of Robert alone at fishing lakes or company events. They sat at the kitchen table with plates of grilled chicken and corn on the cob, the ceiling fan turning slowly above them. Conversation began with safe topics: her conference schedule, his latest project at work, a neighbor who had recently moved away. Emily listened carefully, noting the rhythm of his voice, the ease with which he avoided anything personal. At one point he laughed about a colleague who had misread a spreadsheet, and for a brief second she saw the version of him that had once seemed confident and steady. After they finished eating, he leaned back in his chair and asked, "So what is really on your mind?" The question was not accusatory. It was observant. Emily felt her pulse steady rather than spike. She reached into her purse and placed the envelope on the table between them without opening it. The paper lay flat against the wood surface, quiet but undeniable. Robert's eyes shifted to it, then back to her face. In the space between his glance and his next breath, Emily understood that this conversation would not be loud or dramatic. It would be measured. The holiday comment had planted a question. The letter had provided context. Now, sitting across from the man who had shaped much of her childhood from a distance he never fully acknowledged, she prepared to ask him whether he was ready to speak about the version of the past that had never been fully addressed. Robert looked at the envelope for a long moment before reaching out and turning it slightly with his fingertips, as if adjusting its position might change its significance. The ceiling fan continued its slow rotation above them, stirring the warm evening air. "What is this?" he asked, his voice even but quieter than before. Emily folded her hands on the table and met his gaze directly. "I found it in the filing cabinet at the storage unit," she said. "Mom wrote it a few years ago." She watched his expression carefully. There was no visible shock, but there was a subtle tightening around his eyes, a recognition that this was not a casual visit after all. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "Your mother kept a lot of papers," he said, attempting a light tone. That did not fully settle. Emily nodded once. "She kept clarity," she replied. The word lingered between them. Robert glanced at the envelope again, then back at her. "Is this about the other night?" he asked. It was not a full acknowledgement, but it was enough. Emily did not raise her voice. "When you said I was not supposed to be here," she said carefully, "I need to know what you meant." The kitchen clock ticked steadily against the wall, each second marked with quiet precision. Robert rubbed his hands together once, as if warming them, though the room was not cold. "I had a few drinks," he began. "People say things." Emily did not interrupt. She simply waited. Silence, she had learned, often encouraged more honesty than argument. After several seconds, he continued. "When your mother told me she was pregnant, I was not ready. I had just stepped into a new role at work. I was trying to build something stable. It felt sudden." He paused, searching for language that would not sound harsh. "I worried about what it would cost, about whether I could do it right." Emily listened without flinching. "Did you ever stop worrying?" she asked. The question was not accusatory. It was direct. Robert looked down at the table. "You grew up fine," he said. "You did well in school. You have a good job." It was an answer about outcomes, not feelings. Emily reached into her purse and slid the letter partially out of the envelope, not unfolding it yet. "Mom said you used the word mistake once," she said quietly. "Did you believe that?" The fan continued to turn. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street. Robert's shoulders shifted slightly, as if the weight of the years had become more tangible. "I was scared," he said finally. "Scared that I would not measure up. Scared that everything I planned would change." He did not deny the word. He did not fully defend it either. Emily absorbed the admission without visible reaction. The clarity she had gained from the letter steadied her now. "Fear is one thing," she said. "But you told everyone I was an accident." That is not fear. That is definition. Robert's eyes met hers again, this time without deflection. The space between them felt different than it had at the start of dinner. Less guarded. More exposed. 4. The first time in the conversation, he did not reach for humor or convenience. He simply sat with the question, aware that whatever he said next would not erase the past, but it might determine how it would be remembered from this point forward. Robert did not answer immediately. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the kitchen table, his fingers loosely intertwined, as if he were negotiating a contract rather than revisiting a memory. The overhead light cast a soft shadow across his face, emphasizing lines Emily had not fully noticed before. When I said that, he began slowly, I was not thinking about definitions. I was thinking about how unprepared I felt back then. He paused, choosing his words with unusual care. It was easier to call it unexpected than to admit I was overwhelmed. Emily kept her posture steady, her hands folded near the envelope. Unexpected is different from unwanted, she said quietly. Robert inhaled, then released the breath in a measured way. I never did not want you, he replied, the double negative slipping out before he corrected himself. I just did not know how to be ready. The distinction felt subtle but significant. Emily watched him closely. Mom wrote that you adjusted, she said, that you showed up. But she also wrote that some distance never fully disappeared. Robert's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. Your mother believed in growth, he said. She believed people could evolve just by choosing to. He glanced toward the living room, where an old framed family photograph hung above the mantel. I thought working harder was the same as loving better. The statement hung in the air. Emily understood that for him, providing stability had been proof of commitment. Yet the gap between provision and presence had shaped her childhood in ways he had never measured. When you joked about it, she continued, it did not sound like fear. It sounded like you were stating something you had accepted as fact. Robert rubbed his forehead with his fingertips. I did not realize it still carried that weight, he admitted. To me, it was a story about timing. To you, it was identity. The kitchen felt smaller now, as if the walls were absorbing the honesty being spoken. Emily slid the letter fully out of the envelope and unfolded it, placing it gently on the table so that the underlined word was visible. She chose me, she said. She calculated the risks. She made the decision knowing you were uncertain. Robert's eyes lowered to the page. For a moment, his expression softened in a way that felt less guarded. She was always braver than I was, he said quietly. The admission did not come with resentment. It came with humility. Emily felt a shift inside herself, not toward forgiveness, but toward understanding. I do not need you to rewrite the past, she said. I just need you to acknowledge that I was never a mistake. The simplicity of the request made it impossible to deflect. Robert looked up, meeting her eyes without distraction. You were not a mistake, he said clearly. You were a responsibility I did not feel ready for, and that is different. I handled it imperfectly. Emily held his gaze, measuring the sincerity behind the words. The kitchen clock continued its steady rhythm, marking the moment without ceremony. Nothing dramatic occurred. No raised voices. No sweeping gestures. Just a conversation that had been postponed for decades finally unfolding across a wooden table in a quiet Texas home. And in that measured exchange, Emily sensed that while the past could not be altered, the language used to describe it could be corrected. For a few seconds after Robert spoke, neither of them moved. The air in the kitchen felt steady, almost fragile, as if raising their voices would undo the small progress that had just been made. Emily studied her father's face, not searching for perfection in his apology, but for alignment between his words and his expression. He did not look defensive. He did not look amused. He looked older, in a way she had not noticed before, as if acknowledging the past had required energy he was not used to spending. You handled it imperfectly, she repeated quietly, letting the phrase settle. Do you know what that felt like growing up? Robert shifted slightly in his chair. I thought I was doing what a father was supposed to do, he said. Working overtime, making sure the mortgage was paid, saving for college. Emily nodded once. You did those things, she agreed. But sometimes it felt like I had to earn space in your schedule. The statement was not bitter. It was factual. She recalled school award ceremonies where she scanned the audience before. Stepping on stage, never fully certain he would be there until she saw him. She remembered the careful tone she used when asking for help with homework, gauging his mood before deciding whether to proceed. None of it had been dramatic. It had been subtle, consistent, and shaping. Robert listened without interrupting. His fingers tapped lightly against the table once, then stilled. "My father never came to anything," he said after a moment. "Not games. Not graduations. He believed children were supposed to adapt." He looked up at her. "I thought being physically present was already an improvement." Emily absorbed the context. It did not erase her experience, but it explained part of his framework. "Improvement is not the same as connection," she said gently. "Mom connected. She showed me I was chosen. I never needed you to be fearless. I just needed you to be clear." The word clear lingered again, echoing the letter's theme. Robert exhaled slowly. "I did not realize my hesitation lingered," he admitted. "I thought time would erase it." Emily shook her head slightly. "Time does not erase language. It reinforces it." The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking the rhythm of a conversation decades in the making. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street, then quieted. Life continued, ordinary and undisturbed. Inside the house, however, something had shifted. Emily did not feel like a wounded child demanding reassurance. She felt like an adult asking for acknowledgement. "When you say I was not a mistake," she said finally, "I need you to understand that I am not asking for comfort. I am asking for correction." Robert met her gaze directly. "Then let me correct it," he replied. "You were not an accident. You were not an inconvenience. You were a responsibility that scared me, and I let that fear shape how I spoke. That was my failure, not yours." Emily felt the words settled differently than the earlier explanation. They were more direct, less cautious. For the first time that evening, she sensed not just recognition, but ownership. And in that measured exchange across a worn wooden table, she understood that while her mother had chosen her decades ago, her father was only now learning to say it without hesitation. The silence that followed Robert's final words did not feel heavy anymore. It felt settled. Emily did not rush to fill it. She allowed the correction to exist on its own, unforced and unembellished. The overhead light cast a steady glow across the kitchen table, illuminating the letter that lay open between them. For years, she had imagined this kind of conversation unfolding in raised voices or dramatic confessions. Instead, it arrived quietly, in measured sentences and deliberate pauses. Robert cleared his throat softly and leaned back in his chair, as if adjusting to a new posture he had not practiced before. "Your mother believed in speaking things into clarity," he said. "I should have learned that sooner." Emily folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope, not to hide it, but to preserve it. "She did not want me to carry your fear," she replied. "She wanted me to understand it without absorbing it." Robert nodded slowly. "I see that now." The admission did not undo the years of subtle distance, but it reframed them. Emily studied the room around her, noticing how familiar everything felt and yet slightly altered by what had just been spoken. The refrigerator hummed quietly. A dish towel hung neatly from the oven handle. Ordinary details in an ordinary house. And yet the atmosphere had shifted from avoidance to acknowledgement. "I cannot change how I reacted back then," Robert said. "But I can be more intentional about how I speak now." Emily considered the statement. It was not a promise of perfection. It was a commitment to awareness. "That is all I needed," she said. "Not a different past. Just accurate language." Robert gave a faint, almost self-conscious smile. "You have always been precise," he replied. "Even as a kid." She allowed herself a small smile in return. For the first time that evening, the exchange felt less like negotiation and more like mutual understanding. Outside, the sky had darkened fully, and the porch light cast a soft glow through the kitchen window. Emily stood, placing her purse over her shoulder. "I have an early session tomorrow," she said. Robert rose as well, walking her to the front door. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic reconciliation, just a quiet recognition that something long unspoken had been addressed. At the doorway, he paused. "You were never a mistake," he said again, this time without hesitation or qualification. Emily met his eyes and nodded once, not because she needed reassurance, but because she acknowledged the correction. As she stepped into the warm Texas night, the air felt lighter against her skin. The past remained intact, with all its imperfections, but its description had changed. And sometimes, she realized, that was enough. She walked to her car with steady steps, the envelope resting securely in her purse, aware that while her mother had chosen her decades ago, she had now chosen to confront the narrative that shaped her. The highway lights in the distance flickered steadily as she drove back toward her hotel, carrying with her not a dramatic victory, but a quiet recalibration of truth. Emily returned to her hotel room that night with a steadier heartbeat than she had expected, the hallway carpet muffling her footsteps as she walked toward the elevator. The city outside hummed faintly through the glass windows, headlights moving in orderly streams along the highway below. Inside her room, she set her purse on the desk and removed the envelope once more, not to search for new revelations, but to sit with what had already been uncovered. She placed the letter beside her laptop and stood for a moment at the window, looking down at the parking lot illuminated by soft white lights. There was no dramatic rush of emotion, no tears, no triumphant sense of victory. What she felt instead was recalibration. The conversation at the kitchen table had not rewritten her childhood, but it had corrected a narrative that lingered in the background for years. She thought about the subtle moments from her youth that now carried new context. The way her father hesitated before volunteering at school events, the cautious pride in his voice when introducing her to colleagues, the practical advice he offered instead of affection. Those patterns no longer felt like silent rejection. They felt like evidence of a man navigating fear without language to express it properly. Emily sat on the edge of the bed and reread the final lines of her mother's letter, tracing the underlined word again with her fingertip. Chosen. It no longer felt like a defense against accusation. It felt like a foundational truth that did not depend on anyone else's readiness. She realized that part of her unease over the years had stemmed from sensing an unspoken tension, a story partially concealed beneath polite explanations. Now that the tension had been acknowledged openly, its hold over her had lessened. The next morning at the conference, she moved through presentations and networking sessions with a quiet clarity that surprised her. When colleagues introduced themselves and asked about her background, she answered simply, without the subtle hesitation that once accompanied discussions about family. During a coffee break, she stepped outside the convention center and called her Aunt Linda, not to recount every detail of the conversation, but to say that she and her father had talked. "That is good," her aunt replied gently. "Your mother always hoped you would." Emily ended the call and looked up at the bright Texas sky, the temperature already climbing toward 90 degrees. She understood that reconciliation did not require dramatic displays. It required accurate language and steady boundaries. Later that afternoon, she received a brief message from her father. "Drive safe when you head back to Austin. Thank you for coming by." The words were simple, but they carried a tone different from before. Not defensive, not dismissive, just present. Emily smiled faintly at the screen before slipping her phone into her bag. The past remained layered and imperfect, but it was no longer undefined. And as she prepared to return to her own apartment and her own routines, she carried with her not a need for validation, but a quiet assurance that her existence had always been deliberate, even if it took decades for everyone involved to speak that truth without hesitation. The drive back to Austin felt different than it had the week before. Emily kept the cruise control steady at 70 miles per hour, watching the Texas landscape stretch wide and open beneath a pale blue sky. There was no tightness in her chest this time, no replay of careless words echoing in her mind. Instead, there was a quiet evaluation of what had shifted and what had not. The conversation at her father's kitchen table had not transformed him into someone new. He was still practical, still measured, still more comfortable discussing projects than feelings. But something essential had changed. He had named his fear without disguising it as humor. And in doing so, he had removed a layer of ambiguity that had followed her since childhood. When she reached her apartment complex in Austin, she carried her suitcase upstairs and set it down by the door, pausing before unpacking. The space felt familiar, grounded in routines she had built independently over the past decade. She placed her purse on the kitchen counter and removed the envelope once more, not out of urgency, but out of respect. She slid the letter into a small wooden box she kept in her bedroom, alongside a few photographs and personal mementos. It did not need to be revisited constantly. Its purpose had been fulfilled. Over the next few days, Emily noticed subtle differences in her own reactions. When a coworker made a casual joke about family expectations, she did not feel the faint defensive instinct that once surfaced. When she passed by a park where a father helped his child learn to ride a bicycle, she did not automatically compare it to her own memories. The past had not disappeared. It had simply been clarified. Later that week, her father called in the early evening. The conversation was brief, centered on ordinary topics, but his tone carried a steadiness that felt intentional. He asked about her presentation at the conference and listened fully to her response without redirecting the focus. Before ending the call, he paused. "I meant what I said," he added quietly. "I should have said it differently a long time ago." Emily stood by her kitchen window, looking out at the city lights flickering on as dusk settled. "I know," she replied. The exchange was simple, but it confirmed that the earlier conversation had not been temporary or performative. It had been acknowledged internally. As the weeks passed, Emily began to recognize that identity is not defined solely by how someone begins, but by how they interpret and correct the narratives surrounding that beginning. Her mother had chosen her with courage. Her father had confronted his fear with honesty, albeit decades later. And she had chosen to seek clarity instead of carrying quiet doubt. Standing alone in her apartment one evening, she realized that what once felt like a fracture in her story had become a point of structure. Not dramatic, not grand, just firm. The careless comment that had sparked everything no longer lingered as a wound. It had become a catalyst. And in that steady, measured transformation, Emily understood that truth, when spoken clearly, does not always explode into change. Sometimes it simply recalibrates the ground beneath your feet, allowing you to stand without questioning whether you were ever meant to be there at all. Months passed with a steadiness that felt unfamiliar but welcome. Emily did not revisit the storage unit again, and she did not reread the letter. She no longer needed to. Its meaning had settled into her like a structural beam inside a house, invisible but essential. What changed most was not her father's behavior, which remained measured and practical, but her interpretation of it. When Robert called on Sunday evenings, as he had begun doing more consistently, she listened without searching for hidden hesitation. When he asked about her work projects or mentioned small repairs he had made around the house, she heard presence rather than obligation. One afternoon in early fall, nearly 3 months after their conversation, Emily drove back to Dallas for no professional reason at all. The sky was clear, the air cooler than it had been during the summer, hovering in the low 70s. She parked in the familiar driveway and noticed that the front porch had been repainted, the old blue replaced with a neutral gray. Robert opened the door before she knocked, surprised but not unsettled. "Did not expect you today," he said, stepping aside. "I did not expect myself either," she replied with a faint smile. They sat in the living room this time instead of the kitchen. A football game played softly on the television, though neither of them paid much attention to it. The conversation was not centered on the past. It was centered on the present. Robert asked about her plans for the holidays, and she spoke about a potential promotion at work. There was no dramatic declaration of closeness, but there was less space between sentences. At one point, he stood to retrieve 2 glasses of iced tea from the kitchen and returned with an old photo album in his other hand. "I found this in the closet last week," he said, placing it on the coffee table. Emily opened it slowly. The first few pages held photographs from her early childhood. There was an image of her at age 3, sitting on her father's shoulders at a county fair, cotton candy in her hand. In another, he knelt beside her at a small plastic table, helping her assemble a puzzle. The pictures did not match the distant version she had constructed in her mind. They showed effort, imperfect but present. "I forgot about some of these," Robert said quietly. "You were loud," he added, almost amused. Emily laughed softly. "I still am," she replied. As she turned the pages, she realized that memory, like language, can be selective. The narrative she had carried for years had emphasized hesitation. Now she could see moments of engagement she had overlooked, not because they erased the fear, but because they coexisted with it. When she closed the album, she looked at her father with a steadier understanding. He had not been flawless. He had not been fearless, but he had shown up more often than she had allowed herself to remember. And in that quiet living room, with afternoon light filtering through the curtains, Emily understood that clarity does not always lead to dramatic transformation. Sometimes it simply restores balance to a story that was never entirely one-sided. The careless remark that once felt defining had become a footnote. What remained was not a perfect relationship, but an honest one, grounded not in rewritten history, but in language finally aligned with truth.